Cannabis Europa at Prohibition Partners Live.
Hi, welcome. Thank you for joining us. You're watching Prohibition Partners Live. We're here in the Cannabis Europa stage, the virtual stage, and this is for our panel discussion on social and criminal justice reform. My name's Kevin E.G. Perry. I write about cannabis for places like Playboy and Vice, and today I'm going to be joined by a panel of experts who are from all over the world, and we're bringing their own sort of local perspectives. So from the UK, we have Steve Rolls, who's a senior policy analyst at the drug reform organisation Transform. We've got Amber Moore, a senior researcher at the Conservative Drug Policy Review Group, the author of last year's Public Attitudes to Drugs in the UK 2019, Is the UK Ready for Drug Policy Reform? From Spain, we have Albert Tio from FEDCAC, an association of Barcelona's cannabis clubs. And last but not least, from the United States, we're joined by Steve DeAngelo, founder of the Last Prisoner Project and a renowned activist who's often called the father of the cannabis industry. I think if we're going to talk about social and criminal justice reform, I think it makes sense right now to sort of acknowledge the Black Lives Matter protests which are going on around the world. Obviously, there's a lot of the issues about policing are very related, I think, to what we're going to be talking about today. And I'd like to start in the States with you, Steve DeAngelo. I've been reading a lot about the Last Prisoner Project, particularly there was a great piece in The Intercept last year about Michael Thompson. This is a 69-year-old guy who's still serving a 40 to 60-year life sentence for selling 3 pounds of pot to an undercover informant in 1994. I mean, it's obvious to me, reading stories like that these guys shouldn't be in prison. I mean, he's just one of a number of people you're working with. It's very obvious to me. What are the legal challenges? Why isn't it obvious to everyone? What are the things that are stopping these sorts of records being expunged?
Well, there's two kinds of challenges. By quantity of prisoners, probably the largest challenge is that cannabis is not yet fully legal in most states in the United States, and that makes it very difficult to advocate for the release of prisoners who are incarcerated for a crime that is still a crime. Now, in the 10, 11, arguably U.S. states that have legalized cannabis and have legal cannabis markets, the nature of the challenge is a bit different. So one of our initiatives focuses on clemency. In the United States, the governor of any state has the power, with the stroke of a pen, to release any prisoner who's in those state prison system. And in the United States, there's 40,000 plus cannabis prisoners currently incarcerated in state prison systems. We think that the political lift for a governor in a state where cannabis has been made legal is pretty low. You're just asking the governor to let people out of prison for something that's not a crime anymore. But the clemency process has some roadblocks to it. And those roadblocks go to the fact that most governors' offices only have one person reviewing these petitions. They only review a few a year. And they tend to be very conservative in the way they make the decisions. So one of our strategies is to work with the governor's offices in legal cannabis states to persuade them to have an expedited clemency process where you would have, several hundred to several thousand prisoners in any given state would receive clemency, provided their cases hit certain parameters, that they didn't sell to kids, that they weren't involved with other drugs, et cetera. So that's one example of the structural blockades that we're trying to overcome when it comes to releasing prisoners.
Obviously, another one of the issues that this brings up is about policing and about how strict policing is. And I want to bring in Albert on that, because from what I've read about the situation, I haven't smoked cannabis in Barcelona, I have to admit. But my understanding of it is that with the sort of cannabis clubs that exist now, from what I've read, it seems to me, my concern about it is it seems like there's a lot of discretion is left to police about how strictly they enforce it. Is it being policed fairly? And what have your experiences been with that?
Well, the Cannabis Association movement was born in Catalonia and strongly developed in both Basque Country and Catalonia. Is already a reality spread through Spain, with almost 2,000 associations, half of which are in Catalonia, most of them in Barcelona. The explanation comes from a strong tradition of associationism and self-organization of these two communities, Basque and Catalan, which have often had to fight against the authoritarian imposition of centralist governments from Madrid. We are seeing it now with a paralysis of social laws approved in the Parliament of Catalonia from the Spanish justice system with the excuse of lack of powers in a context of territorial conflict, which is not only that, but a clash of two models of society. One more open, in which politics seems to be more at the service of social evolution, and another one that wants to preserve status quo and privileges, making society have to adapt to unmovable laws anchored in the past. An example of these social laws is the one that regulates the functioning of cannabis associations, approved in 2017 with the majority support of the Catalan Parliament, suspended and annulled by the Spanish Constitutional Court in 2019. It was a process from civil society that collected 60,000 signatures to present a popular legislative initiative, which is the only democratic tool that we have to present a proposal of laws without going through the political parties. We had a very good communication with the political parties, and we appreciated that. And at the end, the law was approved, but it was only active for several months because this constitutional court from Madrid said we didn't have the powers to do it. Like in other parts of the country has happened the same. So now we have a situation where the first associations that started in 2011, we are having problems from a lot of trials we have had, some of them with absolution, but some of them with convicted condemnation of prison. And now we're dealing with 5 years of prison, the directive board of our association. And of course, it's not only police, it's also the prosecutors. And at the end, when you go to court, it depends on which kind of court you have, if it's more progressive or more conservative. But it's a conjunct of facts, not only police, but also the prosecutors, and the lack of regulation is what is provoking all this. So there's a lot of associations that work without problems, but all of them are without any security. So in any moment, they could be policed.
So is there still some uncertainty about how they're policed? I mean,
The uncertainty is complete because now we are starting to have the convictions from the first trials, and it looks like they want to give an example to all the movement, so the people is afraid to start a club. But
Right.
it's a lot of it's a reality, a social reality. It's accepted and tolerated from the administration.
Speaking of uncertainty, I'd like to bring you in, Amber, to talk a little bit about the current legal situation in the UK. I mean, it's 2 years since Sajid Javid said that medical cannabis was going to be allowed. My understanding is that 2 children have managed to get cannabis on the NHS. I read your report last year that said 77% of the British public supports medical cannabis, 76% say that they take it themselves. But NICE, the National Institute for Health and Care, said last year that there isn't enough testing and cannabis isn't safe to be given to children. What's going on? I mean, it seemed like such a success 2 years ago when they finally said, okay, medical cannabis is going to be okay. And I know campaigners and kids with epilepsy who still can't get it. So what's been the hold up, do you think?
Everything that you said is correct, sadly. And, the most tragic thing about this is that the amendment occurred based on the situation, the stories of children in particular suffering from epilepsy. And certainly the amendment has failed to help them, as you say, with only 2 patients actually able to acquire an NHS prescription. What the amendment has done is open up the private market. But what that means is we've effectively created a class system, a two-tier system, because, you know, very few people can actually afford a private prescription. And yeah, that's obviously why access remains still very, very limited, both on the NHS and within the private market, you know, partly because of cost. But actually, all of this was expected. So the ACMD, the government's own advisory council on drug policy, foresaw all of this. This hasn't really changed the number of cannabis medicines that have become licensed. By licensed, I mean that it's gone through what is considered, particularly by the MHRA and by NICE, to have gone through robust levels of clinical trials in order for it to have market authorization. And particularly, you know, if we're considering the NHS, the UK, we have a very, very small private health market. Predominantly people access their medicines through the NHS. And obviously cost is a factor for them, particularly if we keep in mind that, you know, if we have wide access to cannabis medicines that equally may not have the level of robust evidence that's typically expected, this may take money away from new cancer drugs, for example, which could save lives. So it's very difficult. And in the paper, you know, we're looking at the perspective and the needs from, you know, not only industry and regulators, but patients and prescribers. And unfortunately, you know, they're kind of pitted against each other, and it's difficult not to empathize with everyone's position. And the challenge is really going to be creating a sort of regulatory framework that is able to meet all of those needs, and is something that we're going to explore more in the subsequent paper that will be released later this year.
And Steve Rolls, I want to bring you in as well. I mean, we've heard a bit about the legal situation. Obviously, people are buying cannabis in England at the moment, and they're buying it illegally. Where is that coming from? I talked to you the other day about this recent case. I think it was last week. The 43-year-old Albanian guy who burned to death inside a cannabis factory in the Midlands because they were locked in. They'd been trafficked in. I mean, I have to admit, I was slightly naive. I thought a lot of the cannabis I was buying in England was being homegrown by some hippies somewhere and was being delivered to me, and then that's not the case, is it? So can you tell me a bit about how cannabis is being produced in the UK at the moment, and what that looks like?
Well, I mean, in terms of non-medical cannabis, obviously it's all being produced illegally, and you're right. You've identified two of the key sources. There is a minority of the cannabis is being produced by kind of smaller craft growers, who've many are sort of part of the cannabis scene and have been for a long time. But there is also, I think, for the sort of mass market cannabis, the kind of street cannabis that's the majority of the market. It is produced by organised crime groups. Some of them are UK based, some of them are European or non-UK based. And that side of the market, the actual quality of the product is obviously inferior, but it's also associated with violence, with people trafficking, and cases like the one you just described, where your people are trafficked into the UK. Some are coming from Europe, many are coming from Southeast Asia, and some of them are children and effectively being enslaved to produce cannabis in these kind of cannabis factories. So, that all of that unpleasantness, that violence, that exploitation, that criminal activity, that unregulated product is all obviously a direct result of prohibition and the lack of access to a legal market. Now, obviously, if we have a legal market, it's not going to displace all of the illegal activity. I mean, we've seen in Canada and the US, where there are now legal markets, there are still parallel illegal markets continuing, but it's substantially smaller. And each time the legal market expands, it eats away at the illegal market and many of the problems that are associated with it. Now, the good operators who within the legal market, and there are many principled expert cannabis growers. Hopefully, some of them can then migrate to a legal market as it emerges, and the bad operators, the bad actors, can be pushed out. But we don't get to have that choice until we cross that line of legalization, to be able to, make those sorts of choices and effectively, not to use a overused catchphrase, but take back control of that particular market, and then we can democratically make choices about how we want to see it organized, rather than leaving it in the hands of unregulated dealers and organized crime groups.
That's a great point. I'm glad you made that little reference to Brexit there, because my next question was going to be about that there is a sort of folk argument that Brexit and even Corona has created a financial situation in the UK where we may be more likely to see legalization because we need the money. Did you buy that argument?
I think there's possibly some truth in it. I mean, so yeah, I mean, I'm sure Amber can speak to this too. I mean, clearly we have a Conservative government that it's struggling financially because of the various external factors, not least coronavirus, and the opportunity of somewhere between $500 million and $2 billion or more of tax revenue that currently is accruing to unregulated producers not being taxed at all. Annually is actually quite attractive, and given all the other very good arguments for legal regulation, and we're seeing the expansion of the medical cannabis market as well, you can understand why the economic arguments may come into play more. And certainly if you look at the history of cannabis reform in the US, the economic arguments in terms of tax revenue played very well with the public, and a great many politicians of all different stripes. I mean, it's a very non-partisan issue. So I think the economic argument may well play. I don't know what you think about that, Hannah.
I agree. I mean, there's no denying that legalizing cannabis would be, a great economic boost. I think the current Black Lives Matter movement has shown us that, we can't just legalize cannabis for money, that, regulation has to be implemented not only sensibly, but responsibly. And therefore, attempting to undo some of the injustices that have happened because of the war on drugs. And equally, I think what COVID has taught us, coronavirus, is that, the importance of, using evidence and making decisions based on the evidence, whether we have it currently or whether it's emerging. I think often people want this silver bullet type of evidence where it will tell policymakers or regulators, this is exactly what we should do, and this is how we'll do it, and we're going to get 100% guarantees if we do that. But what the evidence is showing us, which has sadly been, absent from drug policy, is it puts us in the right direction. And I think the evidence shows us that we can do a lot more good by sensibly regulating cannabis than the current situation we have now. So I would like to hope that the Black Lives Matter movement, but also our current situation with coronavirus, will help us to kind of move forward in terms of more sensible policy and being a bit bolder as well.
On the economic argument, and it's true that argument's been very, very potent in the United States. It's also true that that it has turned into a problem for us, particularly in California. So if you take a look at the rate at which the underground market has been displaced, there's a great variation in that rate, with some states taking most of the market away, and other states, in California in particular, actually losing ground to the unregulated market since legalization. And the reason that happened in California was largely because of the promises that cannabis activists made and bought into about being able to regulate the market and about being able to raise tax revenue. So, I think that California today, unfortunately, is the poster child for how not to legalize cannabis. The legislature chose to do two things at once. They first, that the context here is that in California, ever since 1996, we've had a semi-regulated medical cannabis market. But semi-regulated was pretty loose. It wasn't heavily taxed. There was a lot of room for innovation, both in business structure and in product formats. And what happened in 2018 when the full cannabis legalization went into effect is that nonprofit medical market was converted to a for-profit adult use market. And two things happened. One, some very, very demanding regulations were put in place for cannabis growers, manufacturers, retailers, every step of the supply chain. And those licensing requirements typically required at least hundreds of thousands of dollars for an applicant to be able to meet, which was well beyond the reach of most of the existing cannabis operators in the semi-legal nonprofit cannabis market. At the same time, the tax rate on cannabis in California was increased from an average of around 5% to an average of close to 50%. So post-legalization, you had consumers who had been coming into legal cannabis shops for a decade, coming in and running out in horror because of the high prices. And when they ran out of those legal dispensaries, they ran right into the arms of all of the cannabis cultivators, manufacturers, and retailers who had been unable to get into the licensed system. And the result has been a decline in market share for the legal regulated cannabis industry in California, to the degree that industry there's been a lot of distress in the industry because of this.
Right, and related to that, isn't it, is the fact that is about who is able to profit from this industry, and often it's certainly not people who've been, for example, arrested for selling cannabis in the past. So what sort of I know. So I read something like 4.3% of legal US cannabis businesses are owned by Black people. So what has been done in terms of social equity, and what can and should be done in your opinion?
So most of the efforts that we've seen to promote social equity in the cannabis industry have been legislative efforts that have been enacted by various different municipalities and even by some state governments. Illinois passed a very robust package. And the thrust of all of this legislation is to create licensing preferences for people of color, people who have been disproportionately impacted by the cannabis laws. My hometown of Oakland, I'm proud to say, was the first jurisdiction anywhere to pass social equity provisions. And since then, it's spread very, very widely and is almost becoming a standard part of cannabis legislation. Currently, it's being discussed at the federal level, and I'm very supportive of those efforts. But what we found is that license preferences are a very blunt tool to address this problem. There's a few reasons for that. One of them is that it's very, very difficult to legally create licensing preferences that clever lawyers are not able to work around. And so what we've seen in far too many cases is that equity licensee awardees, people who actually got the equity licenses, in order to finance their businesses, in order to bring the skill sets to their team that they needed to be successful, they ultimately had to engage in business deals in which they lost control and lost the majority of the economic benefit of the business. So that's one of the issues, but there are many other issues, I think, with those legislatively mandated programs. What I think needs to happen and should happen is that the cannabis industry itself should start measures that are really effective. We're beginning to do that with the Last Prisoner Project. So one of our main areas of focus is reentry and retraining, what we call the Prison to Prosperity pipeline. And we have a variety of programs which are designed to ensure that once cannabis prisoners are released from prison, they are not just allowed into the cannabis industry, they are invited into the industry, they are welcomed into the industry, and they're given support through a variety of different programs in order to be able to succeed in the industry. This is something that the cannabis industry should do by itself. We should not be waiting for government to do it. I think there's a lot of other things that we can do in that regard, but we're the ones who know this industry. We're the ones who run this industry. And so it's incumbent on the 95% plus of cannabis businesses that are not owned by people of color to reach out to our sisters and brothers. Cannabis came to North America and much of the world through the hands of Black people. And anybody who is in this business owes a historic debt to people of color, and we must, as an industry, pay that debt.
Absolutely, absolutely. Albert, I'd like to bring you back in to talk a bit more about the situation in Spain. I mean, do you look at what's happened in the States in terms of commercial legalization and think that this is a way to go for Spain, or does the cannabis club model suit you more?
Well, we think it's not a contradiction. I mean, both models, the cannabis social club model, often prosecuted by police and judicial system in Spain, has been successfully exported to other parts of the world. It promotes a more social model than a commercial one. But it is a response to the still prevailing prohibitionist repressive laws that emanate from undemocratic laws in the case of Spain, from dictatorship. It's for struggle against the prohibition of individual and collective self-cultivation, since not everyone can cultivate at home. It is based on non-profit organizations which must reinvest all profits and surpluses in the association or in solidarity or social assistance programs, as well as in risk prevention and minimization of harm in consumption. I think it is not at odds with a more commercial model, which could coexist with associations. But we already have this network in the whole country, so I think it would be stupid not to use it. But what we don't like is a trend that we are seeing now from the government, in which cultivation licenses are being granted to multinational and pharmaceutical companies in an opaque, not transparent way. Cannabis can be a form of redistribution of wealth, providing opportunities for the most disadvantaged collectives, while the associative movement continues to be criminalized, persecuting its crops and forcing it to provide from illegal networks with all that this entails. When the Code of Good Practice advises to cultivate from the association as a way to fight against the black market, this market is not concerned with the health or protection of minors and the people with mental health problems, whom their use is totally discouraged. Our association, apart from developing a list of solidarity, social and cultural activities, to stimulate participation and social integration, also developed programs to reduce and abandon cannabis and tobacco consumption. You know, Steve, because you were there some years ago in our social group. We wanted to provide with tools to users whose consumption was harmful for themselves. The associations are concerned and monitor the consumption of their members, establishing limit and control, as well as sensitization and awareness, disclosure of information, and quality controls to know at all times what is being consumed, how much, and in what way, to make it as favorable to health and less harmful as possible. So I think in our case, sadly, in that of other associations which we have led these political changes and have worked on political advocacy, we have been overexposed on the political and media level, and this has caused us all the problems we are having now. But I think both models can coexist, and we believe that the commercial one have a responsibility, social responsibility, with also medical research, and should be used this finance to pay for these programs to investigation and medical research, and also for social integration.
Absolutely, yeah. So Steve Rolls, I mean, listening to Steve and Albert there, I mean, what are the in a dream situation where the UK, where Boris Johnson did decide he wanted to legalise cannabis, what sort of model, in your opinion, should the UK be moving towards?
Well, I think it's really important that we look at these experiences with other countries that have already legalized around the world, and look at the models that they've adopted, and try and learn the lessons of the things that they've done well and the things that they've done badly. I certainly think that the cannabis social club model that's been developed in Spain should be part of the UK model. I don't think it's going to be able to cater for all of the demand, but I think it should be in parallel with a commercial model. I also think just allowing smaller scale home growing is going to be vital. I don't think it's realistic, practical, or ethical to try and ban that. I think you just need to put some sort of parameters around it. But more significantly, with the commercial model, I absolutely agree with what Steve was saying, that we mustn't replicate the inequities of the war on drugs in a new kind of market where there is the same domination of rich white men that there is with the illegal market. So I think that looking at Illinois and Massachusetts and their equity programs, the expungement programs, these some of them are better than others. Clearly, there are less. Transform actually has just produced a report called Altered States, where we review all the different state models in the US and try and draw some lessons from them. And there's a very detailed section on the social equity model. It is very difficult. I think, cannabis legalizing, how smash capitalism or destroy all the inequities of global corporate, of the global corporate world. But we do have an opportunity here to do things a bit better, to have more equality, to address some of the social inequities of the past, to make reparations for some of the harms of the past to some of the most impacted communities. And I think what's absolutely vital is that you hardwire that into the legislation from the start. I think if you look at Canada, for all the good things that Canada has done with their legalization at federal and provincial level, one of the big mistakes they made, and they made lots of mistakes, and we need to learn from them too, but one of the big mistakes they make is they kind of overlooked the social equity and social justice agenda completely, and now are trying to retrospectively bring some of those things in. And I think if there's a lesson from that, it's that the social equity dimension needs to be built in from the start. And in terms of the big corporations, I think what we need to do is, make sure that it comes back to a point Steve was making, that we need to make sure that the barriers to entry aren't so high that you prevent the smaller commercial actors from participating. Because if it costs £1 million or $1 million to even get started, you're immediately ruling out 99% of your business opportunities. So we need to make sure that that's a possibility, and we need to, use monopoly legislation, monopoly controls to prevent corporate cap, like the alcohol and tobacco industry.
Yes.
Yeah, we need to prevent a small number of companies dominating the market, turning into a monopoly situation or oligopoly situation like we have with alcohol and tobacco. And you can do that relatively simply by designing into the legislation limits on size of the market sector that are particularly harder to address these things when you're designing them in the first instance. So we need to be having these conversations now, learning the lessons from overseas and building into legislation as it starts to unfold in the UK and places like Luxembourg, who are going through that process at the moment. It's probably going to be the first of the European countries to legalize non-medical cannabis, but there's a whole series of European countries that are lined up, and we're also looking at Mexico and South Africa and New Zealand and other places. They're all having these discussions, and they're all looking to the successes and failures from places like the US and Canada, and learning lessons from Spain, of course.
My strong recommendation in this regard is that if a nation is going to legalize commercial cannabis, that they also at the same time legalize the social club approach. I think that both are really necessary to the success of our industry and to the success of the movement to spread cannabis around the world to everybody who needs it. What we found is that in the world of commercial cannabis, the same set of power dynamics and inequities that work in all other forms of business operate in cannabis. And in California, one of the major factors driving legacy people who have been working with cannabis for their whole lives, people who deeply love the plant and know it better than anybody else, has been the entrance of corporate capital that doesn't want to work with the difficult, independent hippie personalities, and can bring vastly more capital and ability to acquire licenses and properties to the table. And I think that the social club approach offers a sanctuary, a place where cannabis can be produced and introduced to people and taught to people by other people whose motivation is love of cannabis instead of being motivated solely by love of money.
Well, I mean, and that leads perfectly on to my last question, which is about, as Steve was talking about alcohol and tobacco, we think about big alcohol and big tobacco. Is the era of big weed inevitable? And can that be an ethical industry? How do we make that into an ethical industry if it's going to be a big one? Amber, do you have some perspective on that?
Well, the way I see it is we do have an opportunity here to not replicate the worst aspects of alcohol and tobacco regulation. But I certainly echo what everyone else was saying. I think it's going to be so important to ensure that we have the Cannabis Social Club or some form of cooperative model in parallel with the commercial space. In that way, we kind of can prevent this corporate capture, which can actually cause a lot of harms if we don't manage that. And it's really important to give people an alternative. The thing with cannabis is that we do have a lot of very knowledgeable users out there. And certainly when I was looking at patients unlawfully growing their own cannabis, a lot of them have a huge wealth of knowledge through either growing their own cannabis or they access it from a cannabis social club, albeit not the same as you would get in Spain and Barcelona, because that's entirely unlawful here. And it's not fair either to force those people to have to go and access what might be quite a narrow cannabis range of products, rather than grow and use a product that they have tended to over years and found a formulation that they feel works for them. So yeah, the importance of having the cannabis social model, I think, is essential in terms of avoiding some of the kind of big weed markets that we're seeing elsewhere.
Mm-hmm. Steve Rolls, I want you to pick up on this question as well, but also you mentioned earlier that in terms of social and criminal justice, these things have to be baked into legalization right from the very start. What can you give me some examples of what exactly you mean when you say that? What are the sorts of policies or rules of legalization that we will be looking for if we want an ethical industry?
Well, I mean, I think the process is very important. You have to get all the right stakeholders involved in designing the policy. You have to get impacted communities. You have to get growers. We have to get people who understand about environmental sustainability. We have to get people who understand about social justice and tax justice and so on. They all need to be involved in that discussion. What we don't want to do is for the policy process to be overtaken by corporate interests, because then policy would look very different. But in terms of the sorts of things you can do, so in Massachusetts, for example, an individual commercial entity can only have 3 retail licenses. So you can prevent the kind of Starbucksization or McDonald'sization. I'm just inventing words here, but you know what I mean, of cannabis retailing, for example. Or you could do what some provinces have done in Canada, and you have like their retailing of alcohol, you have state monopoly retailing of commercially produced cannabis products. So these are other options. That you can have for-benefit corporations or social enterprises. There are kind of non-profit or non-corporate models for and cooperative models for making cannabis available. Now, I'm not suggesting that those are necessarily going to be all of the market, but I think a point that pretty much everybody has made here is that it's good to have a multi-tiered market so that there are options. I don't think we're going to be able to prevent big corporate interests from entering the market completely. I mean, they are already there. You know, these big Canadian corporates are already, hoovering up cannabis interests around the world in anticipation of legalization spreading. And, we have to find ways of managing those companies to make them, put in place environmental sustainability, to make sure that they are acting ethically in terms of diversity and social justice. And if they're not going to do it off their own backs, then we have to legislate it. And that's then when it switches to individual governments to make those decisions and do it right at the start of the market, and not try and retroactively retrofit a failed or broken policy with ethical components later on. So the process is really, really important, and a legislatively led process that involves an expert commission with all the stakeholders involved is, I think, a very good way to proceed.
No, I just wanted to say that this is the exact point we are trying to do in Spain before the regulation comes. We're trying to promote an organization in which we are all represented: users and cultivators, associations and federations, patients and the health system, activism and politics, the legal industry, and the one that can become legal, kind of lobby, but I don't like so much that word. That can push towards the comprehensive regulation and legalization and can then serve other countries. I know you already work in this kind of projects, but perhaps the pandemic situation may be a good opportunity to come together and show the rest of the society that a change of laws in this sense is more a solution than a problem itself.
That's perfect. I think that's unfortunately all we have time for. But thank you all very much for taking part today, for your thoughts, for your expertise. That's Steve Rolls, Steve DeAngelo, Albert Teo, and Amber Moore. And thank you for watching.